Hello everyone and welcome to the First Cut Rate Commander Quick Precon Upgrade Guide, a new series where we take precon decks we're unable to dedicate a full upgrade guide to, and bring them up to cut rate standards. My name is Grazzet and today we'll be covering the Warhammer 40k Tyranid Swarm Precon and its face commander, the Swarmlord, to which we'll be adding roughly $35 worth of upgrades to bring its power level up on a budget. But before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you like this content and would like me to continue making more videos like this in the future. And if you're feeling particularly generous, please consider buying me a coffee at the link in the description to keep me caffeinated as I work on more of these builds. So with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. This precon's face commander is the Swarmlord, a 5/5 Tyranid that costs 3 and Temur that possesses the following abilities: Rapid Regeneration, which has the Swarmlord ETB with 2 +1/+1 counters for each time we've cast it from the command zone this game, and Xenos Cunning, which, whenever a creature we control with a counter on it dies, draws us a card. Breaking down its core stats, the Swarmlord is sporting a pretty hefty CMC and stat line to match, along with a pair of +1/+1 counter-focused abilities that allow us to load it up with counters as it comes down, and turning counter-laden creatures into card advantage as they get removed. Taking a closer look at its first ability, it serves as both a reliable way to get +1/+1 counters on our commander right away as it comes in with 2 as soon as it comes down, as well as a way to artificially scale up our commander as we continually cast it from our command zone, functionally turning it into an 8 mana 9/9, a 10 mana 11/11, and so on. This of course works very well with its +1/+1 counter-focused game plan to allow it to benefit from any counter payoffs we may be running, as well as helping make up for any commander tax we may have to pay to recast it by providing a bigger stat block to compensate. Then its second ability turns the counters both on itself and on any of our other creatures into draw as those creatures are removed, making it a superb counter payoff that can be used to allow big X-Spell creatures that we've pumped lots of mana into to scale up to replace themselves upon death, or if we're taking a more go-wide tokens approach, generating substantial card advantage as our counter-laden tokens get picked off or sacked for value. So, as we can see, the Swarmlord is a big commander that cares about +1/+1 counters, and, to its credit, this precon has done a superb job to represent that, with a good number of its fellow Tyranids possessing the new Ravenous keywords to incentivize us pumping mana into them to not only load them up with counters, but also allowing them to cantrip once they get big enough, along with other Tyranids that are capable of distributing even more counters to their brood, or instead serving as counter payoffs to make those counter-laden Tyranids even more dangerous, all of which is supported by an excellent ramp package to help us get to our commander as quickly as possible, as well as generate the mana needed to pump into our ravenous creatures, alongside even more counter distribution and payoffs outside of the tribe to make them even bigger and net us even more value. Therefore, in order to refine this build, we'll be swapping out some of the less counter-centric nids that come in the base build to make room for even more creatures that come into play with counters, adding in even more counter distribution and counter payoffs to further empower and get value out of those creatures, and shoring up the base build's lackluster removal and draw suite to ensure we can deal with threats and keep our hands nice and full. But it appears we've run out of time, as the shadow of the warp has fallen over the battlefield, signaling the arrival of the Tyranid Hive Fleet to this doomed world. And like so many worlds that have fallen before it, it will soon be besieged by the endless teeth and claws and bioweapons of the Tyranid Swarm, perfect organic killing machines that know no fear, no compassion, and only endless all-consuming hunger. And consume they will, down to the last defender until there's not a speck of organic matter left on this planet, leaving it a barren, lifeless husk, only for them to set their unfathomable sights on another planet to fall upon and start the cycle all over again. So, now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's jump right into the upgrades. Starting off with our new creature additions, we'll be aiming to cut some of our less counter-focused Tyranids to make room for other creatures that fit better with our +1/+1 counter-focused game plan. For instance, the Genestealer cult members, Genestealer Locust, Genestealer Patriarch, and Acolyte Hybrid will all be getting the axe here, as their abilities to incentivize our opponents to attack each other, create copies of their creatures as they die off, and turning artifacts into draw can be put to use better in other builds. So we'll be replacing them with the X-cost +1/+1 counter generators Apocalypse Hydra, Steelbane Hydra, and Voracious Hydra, each fitting perfectly alongside our Ravenous Tyranids to load themselves up with counters as they come down, and while they may not draw us cards like the Ravenous Brethren, they all serve as solid and occasionally repeatable removal to help us shore up the base build's lackluster numbers, ensuring we have the tools to pick off front row and back row threats as needed. The same goes for Geierson Starn Kellermorph, who by all means is a fantastic legend to build around, but is severely lacking in ways to enable his 1 damage gimmick in this build. So he'll be cut in favor of Hydroid Krasis, which not only provides our build with another scalable X creature that has built-in evasion and trample, but whose ETB draw also helps pad this deck's relatively low base number of draw sources. It's then on to pruning some of the deck's token generators, with Lictor getting the axe since its token generation is much better if we can flicker it to get multiple uses out of it, along with Gargoyle Flock, whose once per turn token creation doesn't really provide this build with enough board presence, making room for the more +1/+1 counter-focused creatures Forgotten Ancient and Defiler of Vigor, both of which fit nicely into the Swarmlord's game plan by providing easy and repeatable counter distribution to all our creatures, helping them grow even bigger and allowing them to benefit from our counter payoffs in the event that they don't generate counters on their own. Then, as much as it pains me, we'll be cutting some legendary Tyranids that don't quite reach their full potential in the 99, with the Red Terror being sidelined since this build doesn't have the critical mass of red sources of damage needed to grow it into an out-of-control threat, and Deathleaper Terror Weapon being benched as well, serving much better as a commander alongside haste enablers to get the most mileage out of its double strike granting, being replaced with Plaxcaster Frogling and Sporeback Troll, whose graft and repeatable protection in the form of Shroud and Regeneration respectively help distribute even more counters to our creatures and make them more resilient against removal and wipes so that those counters don't go to waste. It's then on to our final 3 creature swaps, which will start off by cutting Venomthrope, who is a fantastic target to mutate onto and buff thanks to its built-in protection and evasion, but fails to reach its full potential in this build since most of our counters are coming from our own creatures who can load themselves up with them, making room for Kodama of the West Tree, who not only provides all our counter-laden creatures with trample to crash through blockers, but simultaneously turns them into repeatable sources of land-based ramp to give us even more mana to pump into our X-cost creatures. The vehicle Goliath truck will then be getting scrapped as well, requiring a few too many hoops to jump through in this build between crewing it and attacking in with it in order to get its counter distribution started. So we'll be swapping it out for Shaman of the Great Hunt, who instead provides all our creatures with additional counters as they get in for damage, on top of giving us a repeatable draw effect that can easily reload our hands each turn for only 4 mana considering how many high power creatures we're running. And finally, for our last creature addition, we'll be exchanging the unreliable ramp spell Explore for the more +1/+1 counter-themed ramp source Fertilid, which in this build serves as a repeatable source of land-based ramp that we can use more than 2 times as we give it additional counters. It's then on to our instant swaps, in which the only change we'll be making will be swapping out Aetherize, which is a bit too much of a reactive board wipe for our typically aggressive deck to take advantage of, in favor of the more offensive wipe Cloth's Will, which we can scale up so that our pumped up Tyranids can survive the blast while scouring away our opponent's creatures, while also giving us the option to blow away their back row instead, usually doing both for us with the Swarmlord in play for double the destruction. Then proceeding to our sorcery upgrades, we'll be swapping out our enchantment ramp sources New Horizons and Overgrowth for the land ramp sources Nature's Lore and Kodama's Reach, which is honestly more of a side grade than a strict upgrade considering how well the base build's ramp package is put together, but considering the base build has no enchantment payoffs, the new additions do get a slight edge for getting lands out of our deck, with the former also letting us fetch up non-basics untapped as a bonus. Then moving on to our new enchantment additions, we'll begin by cutting Tyranid Invasion, which admittedly provides a solid amount of bodies for its cost, but doesn't really play into our +1/+1 counter-focused build, for Garruk's Uprising, which in contrast does quite a bit for our build, providing us with an additional source of AoE trample for our massive creatures to use to pile on the damage, and continual card advantage for us as they come down to help us replenish our resources. Ash Barrens will also be getting the axe here, its fixing being okay but not really worth running in this build considering how much land ramp we have at our disposal, making room for Temur Ascendancy, which this time provides AoE haste to all our creatures to allow them to swing in with their massive bulk as soon as they come down, and, like the previous entry, taking advantage of our creatures' usually high power to net us even more card advantage. And for our last enchantment upgrades, we'll be exchanging Abundance and its interesting but ultimately unnecessary card selection, Starstorm's admittedly decent scalable board wipe, and Opal Palace's far too limited counter distribution for the additional counter distribution sources Primal Empathy, Invigorating Hot Springs, and Rhythm of the Wild, all of which allow us to get even more counters onto our creatures, with the first eventually turning into card advantage as our creatures grow big enough, and the latter two providing AoE haste to allow our massive creatures to swing in as soon as they come down. And finally, reaching our land upgrades, we'll be replacing Cave of Temptation and its Sack for Counters effect for Blighted Woodland and its Sack for Ramp instead to help us build up our mana base even faster, and cutting the Gainlands, Rugged Highlands, and Thornwood Falls for the more easily fetchable Wooded Ridgeline and Tangled Islet, whose basic land types make them more easily fetchable for our non-basic land ramp sources. So, now that we've covered all 22 cards we'll be upgrading from the core build, let's take a look at the breakdown for this quick Precon upgrade. This deck currently has 39 creatures including the Commander, 3 instants, 6 sorceries, 10 enchantments, 5 artifacts, 0 planeswalkers, and 37 lands. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 36 cards that can distribute +1/+1 counters to themselves or others, 19 cards that care about +1/+1 counters, 28 Tyranids, 4 cards that care about Tyranids, 16 X-Spells, 2 cards that care about X-Spells, 3 cards that care about high-power creatures, and 4 sources of protection, giving us an impressive amount of counter generation and payoffs for them as the backbone of our deck, a decent number of Tyranids and X-Spells as strong secondary themes along with payoffs for them as well, and a small number of cards that either generate us value for having big counter-laden creatures, or help us keep those creatures alive through our opponent's removal attempts. For general deck stats, we have 18 ramp sources, 9 card draw sources, 9 targeted removal sources, and 3 board wipes. Our ramp being much higher than normal since we want to get to our CMC6 commander quickly, as well as having as much mana available to us as possible to pump into our X-cost creatures, with our draw, targeted removal, and wipes falling within more normal ratios. Looking at our mana curve, we have 5 1-drops, 17 2-drops, 21 3-drops, 9 4-drops, 5 5-drops, 4 6-drops, and 1 12-drop, leaving us with a somewhat deceptive curve that looks very aggressive at first glance, but this is due to our high volume of X-Spells, meaning we're going to be spending a lot of the early game ramping to get as much mana as possible to pump into our X-Spell creatures to have them come in with as many counters as possible, and later dropping in the Swarmlord to get value out of those creatures if and when our opponents try to get rid of them. The final price of our upgrades then comes out to be $34.97. The price of these upgrades was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. For side grades, additional X-cost creatures such as Savageborn Hydra, Hungering Hydra, and Vastwood Hydra can easily be slotted in to give our build even more access to scalable +1/+1 counter generation, and Vorel of the Hullclad, Evolution Sage, and Deepglow Skate can be considered if we want even more ways to load up our creatures with even more +1/+1 counters. Then for additional upgrades, Lifeblood Hydra is a solid X creature to pump mana into that will eventually turn into card advantage when it's removed. Colonian Hydra is a great addition to exponentially grow our creature's counters every time it swings in. Branching Evolution would give us some nice passive counter doubling from the enchantment slot. And the Ozolith would serve as a superb way to save our counters as our creatures die off, putting them right back into play on the next creature we cast. And finally, we wouldn't be in a +1/+1 counter build if I didn't recommend the Great Henge, which will almost always be able to cast for 2 and generates ramp, life, +1/+1 counters, and card advantage for us, which almost makes up for the fact that we paid nearly $60 for a piece of cardboard. Almost, but not quite. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. With the Tyranids covered, our next quick Precon upgrade will be covering the Forces of Chaos in the Ruinous Powers Precon and its face commander, the War Master of the Black Legion, Abaddon the Despoiler, so look forward to a high damage cascade build featuring him soon. And as usual, please like, comment, and subscribe if you like the content to help keep the channel growing. And if you really liked it, please consider buying me a coffee at the link in the description to give me the energy I need to continue doing these extra episodes. Also, since this is a new series, please let me know what you think in the comments. Feedback is always appreciated. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.